Hi everyone, welcome back to World Civilizations 2. Since 1500, I'm Dr. Ross, here for my penultimate lecture today on decolonization and the process of decolonization. So by way of introduction, as a reminder, something not terribly surprising to us, over the course of basically this course, since 1500, but really accelerating in the 19th century, as we discussed when we talked about the new imperialism, European empires expanded rapidly, notably that of Great Britain and France. These empires were often direct political control by European powers over others. The subordination of a territory, in other words, to a metropole. Other empires were much less formal, such as the one that gradually arose in China, or perhaps the relationships between European powers and certain areas of the Middle East, especially in the interwar period, and indeed after World War II. And in some respects, one could characterize the US relationship with Europe during the Cold War as imperial, or the US with various other places, such as Latin America and the Middle East, as imperial. Regardless of how one defines it, however, what occurs in about 3 decades after World War II was quite extraordinary. It took centuries for European powers to build what this map shows, the global empire, but it only took about 20-25 years for it all to come undone. By 1970, 1975, the era of European empire was essentially over. So the question for today is, how did this happen? How and why did decolonization occur after World War II? And less a through line of the lecture, what are the ramifications of decolonization and its processes for these former colonizing powers today? Excuse me, I should have shown this map during my conclusion. Map of the rapid decolonization of Africa and Southeast Asia during the immediate post-war period. When I put this online on Canvas, you'll be able to see for yourself the dates. Most of Africa decolonizes in the course of the 1950s into the 1960s. India, 1947. We covered Vietnam last time. So to begin, I would like to offer a definition of decolonization, and then I'll proceed into my 2 examples to illustrate how decolonization generally occurred. First India, and then Algeria. So, what is decolonization? What does it mean to say that these various and diverse states decolonized? What does it mean that they achieved independence? And I have a 4-part definition of decolonization. It's a complex definition, but it's worth reckoning with both the ways in which decolonization freed people and its limitations. So first, part of my definition of decolonization. Decolonization means the end of formal political and economic controls by European states over their one-time colonies. This includes the abolition of special treaties in places like China, the use of governors in places like India, all the various, the dismantling of most of the various ways that Europeans or Western powers, more generally, exercise direct control over the rest of the world. Okay? That's the most overt meaning of decolonization, and it is part 1 of my definition. Second, decolonization entailed the end of traditional economic relationships between colony and metropole, between what will become the First World and the Third World. Originally, colonies were meant to export raw materials cheaply to Europe and then buy manufactured goods produced in European factories. And so the colonial system encouraged a relationship of economic dependence between the colonized and the colonizer. With independence, however, that relationship underwent transformation. I can't say that decolonization means that economic relationship ended, but rather that it changed shape. And in particular, it's the rise of national economic policies within the former colonies that changed the rules of the game. That it became in the interest of the former colonies to become themselves the center of manufacturing. Look at the tag on your shirt, made in China, made in Vietnam, made in Thailand, right? The shift away from the industrial economies of Europe and towards concerted efforts by the former colonies to develop their economies independently. Sometimes that means protectionist policies, sometimes that means subsidies, sometimes that means corruption, quite frankly. But in any case, that direct link between a colony that funnels raw materials up to wealthier Western nations was going to be rapidly transformed. Again, none of this is over, right? You can just think about fossil fuels, rubber, today the lithium that is in all your batteries. These relationships do not simply change overnight, and in fact, they don't necessarily end entirely. Third part of my definition, I'll repeat all of these after I go through all four. Third part of my definition is the transformation of the traditional pattern of population movement between first and third world, between colonizer and colony. In certain colonies, Algeria, Kenya, for instance, Europeans went to settle. I mean, you can go further back, the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Europeans moved out of Europe and into the colonies. With decolonization, that pattern reversed. That pattern reversed. And instead, the peoples of the former colonies moved to the West. Moved to the West. And therefore, the kind of political and ideological and cultural patterns that so shape these population movements too are reversed. No longer is it simply the case that the West exports its culture, but the non-West also brings it with it when it moves into whether America, France, Britain, Germany, that sort of thing. So, the different population patterns. Finally, a transformation, this is very much about global politics rather than the simple relationship between colonizer and colonized. Decolonization entailed the waning of European influence over the world. One could then argue that new powers, America, the Soviet Union, eventually China, rise to take its place. But decolonization means that there will be a reckoning with the 19th century, one could say the long 19th century order of things, where it's Western Europe that stands at the height of the global system that we have described thus far. And instead, Europe's influence becomes subservient not only to the United States and the Soviet Union, but also to places that were once subservient to them specifically, such as China and eventually India. So, to just restate for your notes, and again, this is a video, pause, go back. Part 1, the dismantling of formal political controls over the colonies. 2, the transformation of economic relationships between colonized and colonizer. 3, transformation of transformation of patterns of population movement between colonized and colonizer. And 4, the waning of European influence over the rest of the world. That's my 4-part definition of decolonization. So, what caused decolonization? I'm forcing you to look at this map for a little bit while longer. I'm going to talk primarily about two different cases, but I want to at least give you a sense of the general reason why, in such a rapid succession, these territories will achieve formal political independence. You're gonna be so annoyed with me at the end of this introduction, but I have 5 causes of decolonization. So 4-part definition, 5 causes. First, the existence of nationalist movements in the colonies. Almost invariably, prior to World War II, often enough prior to World War I, emerged modern nationalist movements that emphasized the desire of colonized peoples for independence. Most overtly, in the case of the stories I'm going to tell, I'm going to use India to kind of talk about that. Dr. Haynes also mentioned China. That would be an example. Second cause of decolonization, World War I and World War II. The process of fighting these 2 horrendous wars meant that Europe simply couldn't control the colonies anymore. They were overextended. They didn't have the military, economic, or political will to maintain control over its colonies. Third, the example of Japan. That Japan's industrialization and its ability to become an imperial power in its own right demonstrated the fallibility of European power and the ultimate failure of the racist ideology that undergirded it. If Japan could become a global power that could compete on a global stage, then all nations can do the same. That race could not be an excuse for weakness, that Japan served as an example. Even in places that Japan subjugated, such as Korea, China, Vietnam. Fourth cause, Europe, after World War II especially, but also before, enters a period of tension with the United States. And the United States preferred to control the rest of the world through more informal means than the colonizing relationship that Europe had traditionally used. That's for a number of reasons. One is ideological, that the United States at least wanted the facade of liberty and democracy and all that stuff that Dr. Haynes really effectively showed was basically a facade. They also wanted markets, right? The spread of global capitalism meant the end of that economic relationship that characterized empire. So Cold War politics plays a role in this. In any case, since the United States is on top, and Europe on top, and in some sense controlling the politics of Europe after World War II, the continued existence of European colonies proved increasingly problematic. And as the decades go on, European powers found it less and less likely that America was going to put up the money and people in order to maintain European control. In many respects, Vietnam is the exception that proves the rule. Right? That the United States had a great interest in the maintenance of French colonization of Vietnam, but that was a effort that they did not really replicate elsewhere. They much preferred more informal modes of control. Finally, last cause of decolonization, the economics of it. The cost of benefit did not make sense. In fact, it never made sense. The colonies throughout their 19th century and 20th century existence always cost Europe more than it gave them. After World War II, with the devastation of the bombings, the need to rebuild, it simply didn't make any sense. Or it made even less sense than it did before to maintain these colonies. And worth pointing out, I mean, it doesn't make economic sense, but it also was increasingly difficult to reckon with ideologically after the evidence of the Holocaust was revealed. So, just to repeat again, feel free to pause, rewind, but just to repeat my 5 causes of decolonization. 1, nationalist movements in the colonies. 2, World War I and World War II. 3, the example of Japan. 4, Europe's rivalry with the United States. And 5, the economics of it. It simply cost too much. There were 3 patterns to decolonization. 4-part definition, 5 causes, 3 patterns, of which I'm going to discuss 2. As you get my citation, much of this lecture, and especially this breakdown, comes from a combination of my own professor, Dr. Joshua Cole, who is in the course of publishing a book on Algeria, and a very excellent survey of world history called Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, if you're so interested. So, 3 patterns for decolonization. Civil war, represented best by China, that Dr. Haynes covered. Negotiated independence, and what the authors of Worlds Together, Worlds Apart call incomplete decolonization. I'm going to talk about the second 2. And the reason I'm going to talk about these 2 cases, negotiated independence through India and incomplete decolonization through Algeria, is because they are representative examples of the difficulty of decolonization. And what I want to emphasize is that although I just went through these 5 causes that seem somewhat obvious in retrospect, the path to decolonization was incredibly difficult. Africa, for instance, was a continent with over 5,000 different languages. How are you going to form independent nations out of that amazing diversity? Places like India were divided by religion. How would you build an independent nation on the basis of a place that is incredibly divided on religion? How are you going to deal with colonizing powers who, despite all of these reasons to lose the colonies, did not really want to do it, and kind of had to be forced to do so? So in the case of negotiated independence, and let me actually go to my next slide as my examples. In the case of negotiated independence, represented best by India, the kind of classic example of decolonization, you have a strong leader in Mohandas Gandhi who leads an Indian nationalist movement to negotiate with the British to let India go. That's not to say that Indian independence was not violent, and as I'm going to describe, about 1 million people will die in the course of this so-called negotiated independence. On the other hand, you have an attempt to fight off a colonizing power that otherwise wants to keep in control of your country, represented by the theorist Frantz Fanon, who is not a leader of Algerian independence, but rather a theorist of it. And these 2 figures go a long way to explaining the various strategies that could be employed by peoples seeking independence from colonizing powers. And I do, and this should tell you that when it comes to, if we ask on the exam for the significance of these cases, it's much more important to emphasize process and general significance than the exact story I'm about to tell. So, I do want to talk about these 2 strategies, both what they have in common and what divided them, and what kind of led one path, India, negotiated independence, and another path, Algeria, what we can call incomplete decolonization, but what we really mean is violent decolonization. So, I have 2 quotes. They are actually not from your primary source readings. They are from other primary sources, but I think they better exemplify the 2 ideologies that come into play in the process of decolonization than the readings that were included in the reader do. That said, the Gandhi reading does allude to some of these ideas. So, Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma means great one, honored one. It's an honorific. His first name is Mohandas. One said that nonviolence in its dynamic condition means conscious suffering. It does not mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but it means the putting of one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. Working under this law of our being, it is possible for a single individual to defy the whole might of an unjust empire, to save his honor, his religion, his soul, and lay the foundation for that empire's fall or its regeneration. Gandhi argued that the way to ensure decolonization and the construction of a coherent, independent nation was the use of nonviolence to provide the spiritual core of a regenerated India. In other words, Gandhi recognized that although he wanted to negotiate independence, that such negotiation was not necessarily going to be undertaken on an equal basis. And that he therefore in response came up with the strategy that emphasized the power of nonviolent resistance. And you can see the impact of his ideology in the civil rights movement, current efforts perhaps in Palestine, one hopes, and that sort of thing. So two things are at work with Gandhi. On the one hand, he wants to kind of find a source of strength for India. On the other hand, he wants to locate that strength in peaceful negotiation. And that's largely what characterizes the ideology that would lead to India's negotiated independence. The case of Algeria was quite different. India was not a settler colony. It was a colony with a significant British population, but they were not there to live. They were there to run it, to ensure that, say, the opium in the 19th century or cotton or whatever successfully reached Britain. Algeria was different because there were settlers. About 1 million, thereabouts, French citizens lived in Algeria at the time of the independence movement. And this meant that those trying to come up with a way for Algeria to achieve independence faced a different problem. The people who lived in Algeria didn't want to give it up even more than, say, Britain did India. And in response, a theorist from a different French colony, Frantz Fanon, argued that it's actually violence that would bind a people together and ensure that they are able to overthrow their oppressors and create a unified nation. It so happens that for the colonized people, violence, because it constitutes their only work, invests their characters with positive and creative qualities. The practice of violence binds people together, binds them together as a whole, since each individual forms a violent link in the great chain, a part of the great organism of violence which has surged upward in reaction to the settlers' violence in the beginning. Fanon argues that imperialism, colonization, by definition, is a violent act. And the only response to that violent act, the only response to, in particular, the settlers' violence, is violence in turn. Fanon, therefore, has the same goal as Gandhi. He wants to find a way to bind the Algerian people together in order to form a coherent and independent nation after the colonizing power of France is overthrown. But he comes to a strikingly different conclusion as to the best way to do so. You must use violence against the minority white settler population in order to ensure that the strength of the colonized people comes to the fore. And so these two processes of decolonization really reveal, or underscore, or make us think about essential questions about what it means to be an oppressed individual living in an oppressive system. How and what is the best way to resist such oppression? And what justifies the use of violence or nonviolence in achieving one's goals? And so these two patterns of decolonization are not simply lessons for us as historians in order to understand how these colonized people achieved their independence, but rather also what are we to take from them as we try to build a more just world going forward. So, I'm going to briefly outline the two stories for the rest of my lecture. I'm going to be not going into detail. I'm just going to lay out some of the broad outlines. I have plenty of book recommendations for those who want a little more detail. So, Indian independence would be finally achieved in 1947. It was largely achieved in 1947 under the leadership of, as I've already said, Mohandas Gandhi. However, excuse me, despite Gandhi's will or desire to create a whole India, ultimately the path of Indian independence would take a quite different turn. And what emerges from independent British India is not one country, but at first two, and now three countries. India here in the middle, Pakistan to the west, and what was once East Pakistan, but then becomes the country of Bangladesh in the east. And so in many respects, what happens with Indian independence represents a failure of Gandhi's vision of negotiation. Gandhi wanted a multicultural, a pluralist India, whole and undivided. But his mode of nonviolent resistance might have overthrown the British, but it did not bind all Indians, both Hindu and Muslim, together. And I should be very clear about this. India, Hindu, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Muslim. And it's along those lines that India would eventually break apart. That said, in many respects, the story of Indian independence is the classic story of decolonization, both for its nonviolence and for its violence. The path towards Indian independence was led by a political party, the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885 after what was once called the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, more commonly called the Indian Mutiny or the First Indian Revolt of 1857. The men who came, and it was men, who came together to form the Indian National Congress were essentially modernizers. They were, though largely British educated, desirous of using the law, using what they learned of modern politics to gradually encourage and force Britain to give India its independence as a modern nation state. So here we have an image of the first Indian National Congress. One irony, if anyone's interested, note the dress of the Indian National Congress. So I just argue that they are modernizers, but the Indian National Congress often dressed in more traditional Indian clothing. Even though they are fairly Western-oriented. And that continues to today. The current leader of India is actually a member of a Hindu nationalist party. And the somewhat contradictory stance is that while the Indian National Congress still often dresses traditionally, the Hindu nationalists dress in Western suits and ties. So they're trying to, right from the beginning, brings back to history, right from the beginning trying to combine a kind of modernizing stance with a great respect and desire to kind of extend the notion of the Indian nation back into tradition. The Congress, in other words, tried to develop a distinct Indian identity. India, as it exists today, did not exist really prior to British colonization. And we didn't go into too much detail about that, but let it just be known that one of the goals of all these nationalist movements is to define what that nation, what the independent nation is going to look at. And so these elites often turn to Indian history in order to develop a kind of nationalist vision of what future India would be. Although the Indian Nationalist Party was pluralist in ideology, the fact that it was primarily composed of Hindus, and that they often primarily drew on Hindu tradition, which was the majority of British India, laid the seeds for future conflict that would eventually erupt in the partition of India in 1947. In any case, initial attempts to achieve Indian independence in the late 19th and early 20th century quickly turned violent. Riots were not uncommon, and during World War I, despite the participation of a great many Indians in the British military, Britain really was not desirous of considering Indian independence. When Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leader of the a leader of the Congress, of the Indian National Congress, the strategy eventually began to change, and it began to emphasize, in particular, the use of nonviolence. Gandhi was especially struck by the ways that South Africans, especially Indians in South Africa, resisted what was then becoming the system of apartheid. When he worked in South Africa as a lawyer, he brought those lessons back with him to India and really began to ramp up his resistance to British rule after the disappointing outcome of World War I, which did not lead to Indian independence. During the interwar period, Gandhi's activism really took a turn and became more forceful and more media savvy, one could say. When the Depression struck India in 1930, Mohandas Gandhi decided to single out salt to test out his ideals of civil disobedience. As in most places in the world, Indians used quite a bit of salt. Every Indian used salt in their cooking and as well to preserve food. But the production of salt in British India was heavily taxed and was controlled by a government monopoly. So even though salt was an everyday commodity needed by ordinary Indians, it was controlled by the British. And so salt as a product really represented the various ways that imperialism subjugated Indian people. To protest the government monopoly on salt, Gandhi begins in 1930 what became the Great Salt March, a 240-mile march from Western India to the coast to gather salt for free, because salt comes from the ocean. As you can see from this image, let me go over here. The news wires followed Gandhi's march. He was really media savvy, so don't let his clothing or his kind of reputation as a mystic or a peasant fool you. He knew how to use modern technology and modern media to his great advantage. His march was reported on throughout the world. And when he arrived at the coast in order to gather his own salt in violation of the law, in violation of that monopoly, thousands of people had gathered. And when he reached down to pick up naturally producing salt, it was covered throughout the world. After Gandhi does this, he is arrested, he's thrown in jail, and millions of Indians join strikes, they boycott foreign goods, and they substitute indigenous hand-woven cloth for imported textiles as forms of resistance. Indian officials in the colonial government resign in solidarity, and the colonizers of Great Britain are shocked by the ability of Gandhi to peacefully organize massive resistance and organization against colonization. Gandhi, in other words, clearly was capable of mobilizing the masses of India against Great Britain. And indeed, his efforts in many respects were a model, and a model that instilled fear in the colonizing power. Two things, however, intervened to derail the precise contours of Gandhi's vision of a united India. The first is the emergence of a rival organization led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Muslim League. The Muslim League was another independence organization. It was another nationalist organization, but it was one that was deeply suspicious of the Indian National Congress and of Gandhi, and in particular of its Hindu dominance. The Muslim League feared that an independent India, ruled and created by the Indian National Congress, would not be pluralist in orientation. It would in fact be a Hindu nationalist country that would subjugate the Muslim population. Jinnah indeed argues that fundamentally Islam and Hinduism cannot get along in order to justify this ideology. Islam and Hinduism are not religions in the strict sense of the word, but are in fact different and distinct social orders, and it is a dream that the Hindus and Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. So Jinnah is arguing that the vision that Gandhi has for India is a false one. In many respects, perhaps it's purposefully false, right? Designed to trick us. And indeed, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Religious violence in Hindus and Muslims it will become horrendous in modern Indian history. The other thing that gets in the way of Gandhi's vision was World War II itself. By the eve of World War II, Indian independence seemed to be gathering speed, and indeed the conflict itself seemed at first to be a way to achieve it. But with the war, any offer of Indian independence was going to be put on hold. And 2 million Indian men will fight in the British Army during the war, despite Gandhi's really efforts to keep India out of it. By the end of the war, this kind of pause in the movement, the British Empire was intact but incredibly fragile. It was only 2 years later that India would somewhat suddenly, and this is where negotiation kind of fell apart in the kind of speed it goes, Indian independence would be achieved. Indeed, the British had already conceded to the Indian National Congress and to Gandhi that Indian self-rule was inevitable by the end of World War II. The only question was, how would it be achieved? How would we transition from the imperial relationship to an independent relationship? The British, despite recognizing that, however, did not feel that they could just leave. They felt that doing so would be to leave India to violence, and in fact that India maybe wasn't quite ready to be independent. They wanted to have a very slow withdrawal, leaving a kind of federal independent dominion in India under self-rule, but still under the aegis of the British monarchy. In 1947, the events outpaced British planning. What essentially happens is that World War II had basically destroyed the British ability to control the country, to control India. The way that Britain used to control India was by basically sending a few British politicians, governors, that sort of thing, and using kind of local Indian elites to maintain control over the country. However, the war was incredibly difficult on the Indian people. There was hunger, there was deprivation, and the people who once ran the country lost the faith of ordinary people. And instead, in its wake, the prestige of the National Congress rises, and a mass movement essentially takes hold, and events, in many respects, spin out of control of the governing authorities. And so negotiations are ongoing, but as they are, the people themselves begin to kind of take matters into their own hands. And ultimately, what that means is not simply independence, but also incredible violence between Hindus and Muslims. As negotiations, and remember we're still in this negotiated independence, as negotiations are ongoing about the shape of the future Indian nation in 1946 into 47, riots between Hindus and Muslims break out, and Jinnah essentially demands partition as a solution. So the violence between Muslims and Hindus destroys Gandhi's vision of a unified India, and instead, two countries emerge in its wake. The British do agree to the partition solution, and on August 14th, 1947, the country of Pakistan gains independence. One day later, India does the same. In the wake of partition, however, massive amounts of population movement and violence continues. 1 million people will be killed in religious violence in independent India and Pakistan as 12 million people move across the borders. 12 million people will try to relocate in the countries of their respective religion. Gandhi was distraught at the violence and the vision of the kind of India that seemed to be emerging. He eventually went on a fast and refused all sustenance until the killings had stopped and the violence had abated, and it did. Unfortunately, 6 months after independence, Gandhi himself was murdered by a Hindu zealot who felt that Gandhi was essentially too kind to Muslims. Gandhi's death, in many respects, put an end to Gandhi's vision for independent India. That, somewhat surprising, but in other ways not. And there are more aspects to Gandhi's vision that don't come to fruition that I don't have time to go into here. So when I say negotiated independence, I do not mean peaceful. I don't really mean even nonviolent, although that was the strategy. What I mean is that the context of decolonization was created by desire to figure out a peaceful solution, when peace is not necessarily what will happen. Even as negotiated independence is largely the pattern that the African nations and other areas of Asia will follow. That the colonizing power will make an agreement to leave, and they will help shape the contours of the nation that they leave behind. Second example, and I'm going to be brief on my second example, but I think it's still worth talking briefly about. Because in many respects, the case of Algeria for me at least, has some more resonant lessons, I think, for contemporary global politics, especially in the Middle East. Algeria was a special case in many respects. I mean, that's not to say, the process of Algerian independence, one can see similarities in Kenya, especially, also had settlers. But in many respects, Algeria was a special case. Algeria was considered part of France. It was not considered a colony by the French government. If you were in Algeria during the colonial period, you were in France. You were not in a colony of France, you were in France. And so it's closer to, say, if Hawaii or Alaska wanted to leave the United States than it is if, say, than when India wants to leave Great Britain. Or perhaps if Puerto Rico votes for independence, right? It's much closer to if a state wants to leave. And that particularity combines with the existence of those million settlers to create a combustible situation if Algerian Muslims decide they want independence. They are not simply calling for an independent nation, they are calling for something that is kind of directed at the heart of the French state itself. And so when faced with the desire for independence, there wasn't another body willing to negotiate for the Algerians. Unlike in the case of Britain, which acknowledged that India was a different place, was a different country, where Britain at least acknowledged the desire of self-rule by the Indians, there was no such acknowledgement by the French, because they couldn't. They'd be negotiating the independence of one of their own departments, it's actually 3 departments, one of their own countries. And so the political organization that forms in Algeria, the National Liberation Front, the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, will turn not to nonviolence but to violence, largely for the same reason Gandhi turned to violence. to nonviolence. The desire to create a whole, to fight for one's freedom, to create a nation. And violence will characterize the attempt of the National Liberation Front to achieve independence for Algeria. Eventually, the French will find themselves with 500,000 troops in Algeria fighting an incredibly brutal war against the indigenous population. And the National Liberation Front, vastly outgunned by modern military, will instead turn to terrorism in order to fight off the French. And so here's one of those resonances for me. The use of terrorism by an oppressed people to achieve liberation. How do we feel about that? I know that I am sympathetic to the goals of the National Liberation Front, even as I am disgusted by this strategy, and yet I'm not entirely sure what else was to be done in order to achieve their rightful independence. So that's a question, not really a statement. Something to consider. Also worth considering that in response to the use of terrorism by the National Liberation Front, the French military, and this should also be familiar to us, responded with the systemic use of torture and mass movement of populations. The use of torture, such as waterboarding, and yes, waterboarding is torture, and other forms of more physically degrading forms of torture characterize the French attempt to maintain control of Algeria. So Fanon was right. Violence beget violence. But that was in many respects the point. By forcing the colonized people to respond in kind, the Algerians demonstrated the ultimate hypocrisy of the so-called civilizing mission that characterized European imperialism. So the most famous moment of the war, one immortalized in a film that I highly recommend, was a campaign of urban guerrilla warfare carried out in the city of Algiers by the National Liberation Front in the city against various authorities. It's at this moment that the French government essentially gives the all clear to the French military to essentially do everything they can to eliminate the National Liberation Front from the city, including the use of torture. I think because this lecture has gone on a little longer than I intended, I'm going to move a little bit past. But I do have one image of an Algerian fighter being interrogated by the French. If you go online, I decided not to show these images. If you go online, you can find some far more disturbing images if you so choose. By the early 1960s, or excuse me, by the early 1960s, there was a sense even in France that the war was not going well, and that some form of independence to Algeria actually was possible, if not desired. With the beginning of negotiations between the French government and the National Liberation Front for Algerian independence, the French too turned to forms of terrorism in order to ensure that the government would not make any agreement. Put differently, the French settlers and right-wing French activists in France who desired to maintain the colonial relationship basically took up the National Liberation Front strategies and deployed them against both Algerians and French people themselves, rooted in what was unoriginally named the Secret Army Organization, the leadership of whom were one-time French military officers who joined this terrorist organization in order to maintain French control over the country. So, Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, Secret Army Organization. The resistance to Algerian independence, therefore, took place on two fronts. One, the official French government that by 1961 decided to begin negotiations, and the Secret Army Organization that refused any attempt, any acknowledgement of the right of Algerian self-determination. It's the OAS that bombed Paris. In other words, it is French people who turned to terrorism in the wake of the Algerian War in order to maintain Algerian colonization. This is one reason why the French, perhaps the scale is quite different today, but the French have a long history of understanding what it means to be subjected to terrorism in their own city, or their capital city. By the end of the war in 1962, the OAS were killing about 500 people a month. There's an excellent journal written by a moderate Algerian independence activist, published by University of Nebraska Press, who was eventually murdered by the OAS. It is quite excellent. With the end of the war, the end of this violent struggle, a major question emerged. What are we to do with the French people who lived in Algeria? And perhaps more interestingly and more traumatic, what are we to do with the Algerians who cooperated with the French military and attempted to maintain as well French presence in the now independent country? Tens of thousands of Algerian refugees left for France. They were known as Harkis, those who participated on the side of the French, because they feared they would be subject to reprisals with independent Algeria, and formed the kind of vanguard of that broader shift in population that I described when I defined colonization. And so I know that I went over the Algerian situation very briefly. I want to emphasize the ways in which the case of Algeria demonstrates the ways in which violence is not located simply in the oppressed, but also, not simply in the oppressor, but also in the oppressed. But that both sides, as they turn to violence, seem to feed on one another, becoming precisely the thing that they most hated amongst their enemy. And the reason that, even though I wanted to go over this pretty quickly, I still wanted to at least introduce it, is the ways in which this reflects the current situation in Israel. The case of Israel and the occupied territories in many respects reflects precisely the situation that existed in 1950s Algeria. Israel occupies the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and while ostensibly and in line with the international community, we acknowledge those territories as the future home of Palestine, Israel has been sending settlers. And it's the settler question that unites the two cases in particular, and reveals the difficulty of achieving any agreement that could lead to two independent states. And it also, I don't know why I'm looking at my notes, this is not in my notes, and it also underscores the ways in which the tactics of both sides feeds into one another and justifies the continuing violence on both ends. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about Israel next week, but it's worth considering what are some of the patterns we've seen historically that can explain the difficulties of that particular conflict. And I would argue that it's a colonial relationship, and it's a colonial relationship that in particular looks like Algeria. Finally, as we conclude our look at, well, I guess we'll talk a little bit more about colonization, but as we conclude our look at the formal forms of colonization, a brief word of conclusion on the long history and consequences of the imperial project that began at the beginning of the course. It is true that imperial powers built the railroads in places like India, in places like Algeria, in places like Kenya, in places like South Africa. It is not true, however, that they built those railroads to benefit the people who lived there. And the ongoing consequences of imperialism are revealed in a chart such as this, which illustrates with a measure of human development. And I'm not always a fan, I'm actually not usually a fan of these kind of measures, but indicates the ways in which the legacy of imperialism lives on today. It is not a coincidence that the places with the most struggles are precisely the places that Europeans and Americans claimed that they were bringing civilization. It is not because these people, these countries, are naturally more corrupt, are naturally less inclined to develop. It is because the process of imperialism was a process of taking from them for the West's benefit and not giving back. And the process of decolonization, even in the case of negotiation, did not place these countries in a position to take advantage, at least immediately, it's only been 60 years, 70 years, to develop. This is actually quite a better chart than the one I used to have, which was a bit old, but we can see some of the distances between what used to be the third world, in certain places, combining. But this is a history class. And one thing we want you to take away from it is an acknowledgement that history lives on and shapes the difficulties we face today. I will see you one last time a week from today. Yes.